Hey everyone, welcome to another Ask GN. We're shooting 3 today. This is the third one I've shot. Don't know the order they'll go up. One is on the Patreon site, so you can go to patreon.com/gamersnexus to get access to the bonus episodes available to all backers. And then we have some behind-the-scenes stuff from the office available to $5 plus. So this episode, we're talking about, briefly, Snowflake and Midnight, the cats who have been featured on the channel. I'll also be talking about MacBook Pro and thermals. Pretty fun topic that I wanted to bring up because we never talk about Mac. And someone asked about it, and I thought that's a great opportunity to talk about something Apple's done that's kind of sad. So, yeah, great topics for this week. Leave your questions in the comment section below. We're working pretty hard to bring on more experts. So, as you ask questions, if you think there's a really good one that I might not be able to tackle, so if you don't think I can do it, that's fine. Post it anyway, and I will try to find someone who's available to answer it either just in email or is able to join me. And we'll be doing that more going forward as we move into the office too. Before that, this video is brought to you by NZXT's new H500 case, which we recently found to have an impressively effective cooling setup that is entirely negative pressure when stock. The H500 is the successor of the S340 and S340 Elite, offering high build quality that's all steel and glass, and cable management features that are also top class for this $70 compact mid-tower case. The H500 is a part of NZXT's new H-series lineup, which also features options for mini ITX, micro ATX, and full ATX builds. Learn more at the link in the description below. All right, so first note, as always, mod mats are available now. They're shipping as the orders come in. Not quite sold out yet. We're trying to get another order in, but it looks like we're going to sell out before they come in. So if you want one, pick it up on store.gamersnexus.net. We have the chalkboard design shirts there too. It's just a black version of the blueprint shirt. And then we have our video card anatomy poster, which has VRM components, stuff like that. Let's get to the first question. First one is from Soupa, who said, actually, it's really from everyone. It's from the community, because as we posted the movie and vlog videos, I've probably answered like 5 to 10 times each this question. And it's, will Snowflake and Midnight make the move to the office? If not, can we get some B-roll footage of them from time to time? I don't want to have to threaten unsubbing, but if necessary, and I don't blame you. So here's the plan. I don't know if we've talked about this publicly. I think I did in one of the Patreon behind-the-scenes things, not meant to be a plug, but we're getting, obviously, a bunch of new furniture. Part of that's going to be new set furniture. And so this is actually like beyond the cat question. It's interesting, I think, hopefully for some of you. This table, I think, is going to stay here, the famous wobbly table. So I think we're going to leave this here, and I think I'm going to leave the wood wall here. I kind of want to bring it for, because it's cool to have in the background for history, but I like the idea of keeping these two things here. So if at the end of the day I'm like, you know what, I want to do a live stream from home. I want to go home, set up the camera on a tripod, and build a computer, and just hang out with everyone. I'll be able to do that. I'll have a wall, I'll have a table, and I'll get some extra lights, just some cheap ones, to make it possible. And so part of that is we've already, I mean, I thought of the Snowflake thing long before we even signed a contract on anything. And part of that is she'll be able to still be in B-roll shots, and maybe even A-roll if I shoot anything from home, like just a live stream or whatever. So do not fear, they will still make appearances. I am specifically arranging for that. Seems a little silly, but we are. So anyway, the bigger thing here, or well, maybe not, depends on who, maybe the secondary thing to many of you, is that we're going to have just an extra spot for filming. So it wouldn't be a manned camera, I don't think, for those. It'd just be like something that I want to do. And maybe we stream to the main channel, maybe it goes to the side channel, I don't know. Anyway, yeah, they'll still be there, still be in the shots. Next question is from Animation Creations 42, who says, with the recent drama regarding the MacBook Pro thermals, do you think Apple would have been able to get the same performance as the i9 with better thermals with an AMD Mobile CPU if they made a higher-end mobile chips, as AMD CPUs tend to be more efficient than Intel's? So this is a really complicated question for a lot of reasons. I am going to address different parts of this and slightly modify it. So without being specific on AMD Mobile CPUs, because I honestly don't know much about them. I don't know really much about anything that goes in like laptops or phones that isn't also a desktop part or very closely related to one. And I haven't tested any of the AMD Mobile CPUs. So let me change your question a little bit, please, to remove some of the specificity on that. What I will say is that, yes, your question, absolutely the answer is yes, it is possible to achieve the same performance as a high-end part with a low-end part if the high-end part is throttling to a point of being garbage. So the answer is yes. And I don't know specifically about the mobile CPUs, what their specs are or anything really. But I do know that if you have a part that can't perform to spec, then a lower end part that can perform to spec might be better. So yes, definitely. And that's part of the problem I think people had with this initial MacBook stuff, was that if it's throttling to a point of just you could have spent less money on a lower end part and got the same performance, you kind of feel ripped off. But also Apple does at least partially specialize in that particular attribute, ripping people off, whether it's repair shops or individuals. So I'm not saying they don't, I don't know. I'm not going to, I'll leave that there. That's fine. I'm fine with what I said. I thought about doing a wishy-washy thing, giving myself an out in case people wanted to argue it, but you know what? I don't care. I really am not a fan of Apple, so, and that's fine. We don't review their stuff, so that particular subset is not a consideration in any of our reviews. I don't think we've never reviewed an Apple part, and probably will stay that way unless it's something like this, except I don't want to buy a MacBook right now. Anyway, as far as the rest of this, so I will give a shout to Snazzy Labs, who has a good video of taking apart his MacBook Pro. I used that to get a better understanding of what was in there because I'm not going to buy one. And he actually referenced our how CPU coolers work video. So consider this a symbiotic relationship. So from his video, there's absolutely zero surface area on the cooler, or on the heatsink, I should say. It's got just one fat pipe, and it's got some very, very, very tiny fins. So it's not an impressive cooler. This is part of like all laptops, not just Apple. It's part of this like sort of sometimes stupid craze to get just half a millimeter smaller than the next one so that you can make it look like you changed something this generation, which is I find particularly annoying because I don't know, I'd rather my laptops be a millimeter taller and have RJ45 than not. But you know, different audiences, different people. So anyway, what I saw in that video, I saw basically zero VRM cooling at all. I saw very little surface area on the heatsink. The fans aren't particularly good, and you end up with Apple's response, which is, quote, "We've identified that there is a missing digital key in the firmware that impacts the thermal management system and could drive clock speeds down under heavy thermal loads on the new MacBook Pro." They told this to CNET. They also said a bug fix is included in today's Mac OS High Sierra 10.13.6 supplemental update and is recommended. What I understand, this kind of fixed a lot of the problems, but I am going to say I don't fully buy the explanation here. I think the digital key missing in firmware that impacts thermal management system is code for we were running the voltage too high and we down volted the processor. So I think that's what it comes down to. Or they just undervolted it. Either way, I don't know. I do not have one. I can't validate it. But I would imagine undervolting might have played a role. I haven't looked into it. That could be wrong. Well, I mean, I have looked into it as much as I could. But regardless of what Apple claims the problem was, it's still a garbage cooling solution. There's still nothing on the VRM components really of note. And I'm not impressed by what they've built for something as expensive as it is. So yeah, you are correct. In any scenario ever, Apple or not, a cheaper CPU that actually performs versus a 7980XE that's downclocking to 800 megahertz, the cheaper one will be better. So yeah, that's really kind of all there is to it. But anyway, I kind of wanted to buy one just to do some testing, but with the office move and everything, I decided we'll shelve this one for now and let the others tackle it. Anyway, very unimpressed with their cooling solution, regardless of what their software changes do. You cannot fix a poor design with software, and it remains a poor design whether or not the software works around the problem. So I don't know. Next one, Ross Kluczinske says, "What's the limiting factor on CPU air cooler effectiveness, fan speed, CFM, air moving through the fins, tower size, etc.?" Well, the first one, with any kind of ambient cooler, any kind of air cooler, which would include liquid coolers, you're limited by ambient. So room temperature, 20 whatever degrees it may be in your house, Celsius, of course. So that's the big limit. You can't get below that period unless you're using some kind of chilling effect, either dry ice or liquid nitrogen or whatever. or advanced like tech coolers, stuff like that. So this is the first bottleneck you hit, or case ambient. That's another one. Your room may be 21. Your case could very easily be 35 or 40 if it's a bad case being 40. So that's the first limiter. Next one, and that applies to liquid, fin density and fin pitch and impedance. So the angle of the fin pitch, impacts the ability of air to flow through it and effectively hit things like heat pipes, which are sinking a whole lot of the heat, and cool them down. The fin density matters. It has to be dense enough that, do I have a good example? That's a decent one. This is a fairly standard cooler. NZXT made this one. I don't think they make it anymore. Fairly standard though. Pretty much everyone makes one of these. So it has to be dense enough fins that there's a lot of surface area, because a solid block is not going to be any good because there's no surface area. So a lot of surface area, but it can't be so dense that there's impedance and you're blocking airflow, which is a really fine balance to walk. Some of the cheaper ones go too hard one direction or the other, where it's either too many big gaps, or too few gaps that are too small and you can't get the air through even if it's a fast fan, or it's just so loud that you don't really want to get the air through even if you can. So those are considerations. Another consideration, the smoothness of the cold plate. This is a big one that has a magnet on it. Not a good example. The smoothness of the cold plate matters a lot, because if you have a rough surface for something like a CPU cooler, then you're going to be filling more of that surface with a thermal interface. So going back to, I believe you were saying this. No, someone else said this in a different question. Going back to what someone else said in one of these AskGNs, the more thermal interfaces you have between the device under test and the cooler device, the worse transfer you're going to have. It's just more stuff for it to transfer through. You want it to get into and out of metal as quickly as possible. Putting interfaces in between is necessary, but not something you want a lot of. So the rougher it is, the less direct contact area there will be to the IHS, which means that you're going to have more air pockets or more thermal paste, both of which are significantly lower thermal conductivity than copper. So you want smoothness on the cold plate. That's a big factor. And actually, if you look at some really, really cheap air coolers, like $10 to $15 budget garbage bin, then you'll see a lot of them do have rougher finishes on the bottom. This is a problem we had with the GTX 1080 Ti Gigabyte card, Extreme Water card, the air card, the Extreme Air card with 3 fans. One of the problems that had was a really rough cold plate. So that's a problem. There is an instance where that's not true. There is an instance where actually a rougher plate is better. And the example of that would be our Computex coverage, where we talked with Der Bauer, Roman, about his Novec cooling solution, not the phase change one, well, not the phase change loop, but the basically tank full of fluid. And the difference there is that because the GPU was submerged, the video card was submerged in this fluid, this low boiling point fluid, 60 degrees Celsius, something like that, maybe 40, 60s. Having the extra surface area and the scratches in the plate on the surface, on the top side, actually does help. And that's because you're increasing the surface area and you've got water flowing through it. So that's an instance where what I said is not really quite as true. But for an air cooler, smoother is better. And then other notes I have here, let's see, material of the cold plate and the heat pipes. So, and design of the heat pipes. So heat pipes have a fluid in them, and it's pretty simple. Gets down to the cold plate, evaporates from the heat, boils basically, goes up to the top of the tube, condenses, comes back down via capillary action, and it repeats. And some tubes on the inside have a smaller inner tube diameter than other tubes. And so even though you might have 2 6mm or 2 8mm heat pipes side by side from one vendor versus the other, one could be worse. And there are a few reasons. One, the inside of the heat pipe could be sintered, it could be mesh, it could be weave, it could be composite. So these are all different approaches to filling the heat pipe with something to help the liquid move through it. So as an example, you might have a sintered heat pipe where it's just basically like copper dust, more or less, that's fixed to the sidewalls of the heat pipe. And that helps the water travel through and continue dissipating or cooling down as it returns to a state where it can evaporate once again. And another example would be mesh, which is a literal mesh or a weave. And yeah, so that's an impactor too to performance. And then you also have just the diameter of the inside of the tube, where it might be more constrictive or not, depending on how big the inside is, not just the outside. So it might be 8, but one might have a larger inner diameter than the other, and that will impact performance too. And other than that, the contact and surface area between the heat pipes and the cold plate and the IHS. So if it's direct contact, like heat pipe to IHS, that's good, but sometimes vendors will cram in a ton of heat pipes just so they can tick the marketing box and say, yep, we have 8 heat pipes. But the thing is, if like 2 of them are overhanging the CPU and not touching it, or a bunch of them are half touching the CPU, it's not helping. You'd be better off with fewer of them that are fully touching the CPU and fully contacted and smooth and engaged with the surface. So, and then fan speed. So yeah, fan speed matters obviously too. Hopefully that answers your question. I really like I like CPU air coolers. They're fun to talk about. Next one, Reiden Lightman says, why aren't modular power supplies standardized with the shape of the connection to the actual unit? It seems like different brands have their own ideas as to what shape to use, whether it looks like a mirror image of the connector or if it looks like a giant SATA cable. What would it take for this to be standardized? That's a hard, the last part's a hard question. How about why don't they standardize it first? I talked about this in our video about do not mix and match modular power supply cables because you'll kill stuff. And the conclusion we had was it's not necessarily inherently bad that they're not standardized as long as there's a good reason for it, and there isn't always. But I'll give you some of the arguments we've heard from manufacturers. One of them is that they just think they do it better than the other people, and so why should they conform to someone else's standard if they think theirs is better? That's a lot of it. It's like pride. And sometimes it's valid. Another one, the company might want to make a universal header. So EVGA does this with theirs, where some of their power supplies, you can just plug whichever cable into whatever slot you want and it'll work. And there's validity there, but it's more expensive to do, it's bulkier, and all the other vendors don't want to play ball. They have their own way of doing it. So that's what it comes down to. It's they think their solution's better, and that's fine. That's product development, and no one wants to meet common ground. Whether or not it's a bad thing, it's kind of hard to say. If you're not aware that these are non-standard and that mixing and matching kills stuff, which I would assume definitely most people don't know that, because why? I mean, I would think the average user, especially people, like the average user doesn't watch us, first of all. I would think the average user, you look at the end of the cable and you go, okay, that's a standardized pinout. It plugs into a motherboard, it's standardized. Like on our mod mat on stored@gamersnexus.net. So it's standardized. So why would you then think that the other side is not standardized? I don't think the average person would jump to that. I think they would probably assume that they're all standard. So that's definitely a concern where you have people who are going to damage stuff just because they didn't know any better. To be fair, some of the vendors like Seasonic in the past have put stickers like over the power button or over the power switch or over the power plug socket that say do not use power cables from other power supplies. So as long as they say that, I'm fine with it. But why isn't it standard? I think it's just because they all think that they can do it better than the next person, and there are probably supply chain reasons as well. And then also just being different, because let's face it, with power supplies, even though there are differences, things like Ripple, it's just not glamorous, and so you have to find something else to make it different, like, ooh, you can plug this cable in anywhere you want. So I think that's a lot of what it comes down to. NightRush says, why is it some tasks take a while to process despite not using 100% of a particular resource? For example, decompressing a file, 20% CPU, no single core is at 100%, 5% disk, 0% network. Is there just thread sleeps programmed in, or is it something else? First of all, I have decent half answers to this. The other half, I'm not a programmer, so please keep that in mind. I'm not afraid to tell you when I run out of my area of expertise. So I'll let you know when I get to that point. So first of all, some tasks take a while to process despite not using 100% of any particular resource. It could be that giving them 100% of the resource won't speed it up because of on the programming side, we've dealt with this with our own software, so I can speak to this a bit better than other people's software. We have software in-house that processes things for like our console benchmarking. We process really big videos, sometimes compressed, sometimes not, and do frame rate analysis on them. And we haven't optimized the code a whole lot because it's not a a publicly available thing, so who cares? And what happens is, just because the way it's written, we do things like change how many pixels we're skipping when we're processing, or whether it's grayscale or not, different considerations for how long between frames is considered tear versus a drop versus whatever. And depending on those parameters, it can take longer or shorter to complete the task. And the code's just, frankly, it's just not optimized. So it runs really poorly sometimes on certain types of CPUs, and that's all there is to it. It's just we didn't program it with all thread counts in mind, didn't program it with all cache sizes in mind, anything like that. So that's a potential limiter. Outside of code, get into the hardware stuff. It could be a cache limitation. You might be running a program that is particularly intensive on cache. You might be running a program that is hitting something like memory, which you didn't list. There's always a possibility that you're just limited by memory frequency. We've certainly seen it before, especially with our overclocking live streams. Another thing here, I want to bring up a side point, is that I've seen, as multi-core CPUs get more popular, I've seen a lot of people who are really excited that their CPU is not being fully used for like anything. That's not something to be excited about. If you paid for the resources, you want them to be in use. So ideally what happens is it's 100% engaged when you're doing whatever the thing is, gaming or otherwise. And then if you have to multitask and do something that's actually multitasking, ideally there's some thread scheduling going on either in Windows or manually through Task Manager, and you can assign those resources elsewhere, not just have like 30% of your CPU unused, because there's no guarantee that that part of the CPU is going to be used when you open the next application. So that's a complete side note. But anyway, I am not 100% of an expert on this. What I can say on the programming side, let me add, what I can say is that there might be hidden bottlenecks you're not able to monitor. So cache is a great example of this. There could be, and I don't think this is the case with your question, but there could be thermal limitations. Maybe you're hitting TJ max, temperature junction max, and in doing so, it's just not able to run at the targeted frequencies, and so then you have lower utilization overall. You could be running into issues with current limitations, could be running into issues with VRM, SVID protocol between the CPU and the VRM, and whether one is overheating or not. And disk you mentioned, but disk is always a concern too. Interfaces. What interface are you going over to get to the disk? Is that a bottleneck? Typically not, but it can be with SATA, for example, stuff like that. So that's kind of my disjointed answer. I think that'll give you a few things to think about, but I do think a lot of this is going to come down to thread scheduling, Windows, abstraction layers, APIs, software, and some of these things I know more about than others, but that's the best I can do for you right now. APIs I can speak to briefly though. DirectX 12, DX11, and Vulkan, for example, you'll see different resource utilization than those based on how well the game has done to program for that thing. Doom is a fantastic example of Vulkan. Sniper is a fantastic example of DX12. There are a lot of really bad examples of DX12. And in these tasks, you'll see that something like DX12 that's just wrapped. It's like DX11 with the DX12 wrapper. Worst wrapper name ever, DX11. DX12, DX11 wrapper, or the inverse rather, you'll end up with poor resource utilization in some instances, and actually overhead rather than a benefit, which is a lot of the problem DX12 had originally. Anyway, that's the best I can do for you on that one, sorry. Next one, Mage Cecil. Oh, actually, you know what? For any programmers in the audience, please post a comment and just add. Just add to what I said about, like, specifically when you are writing code, what specific areas of optimization can you do to improve resource utilization, make sure that a component's being fully utilized? Because I think we all hear this word optimization a lot, and I'm included in this group of we all, and it doesn't always mean anything. So if you program stuff and you know specifically like when this might apply on a software level and not a hardware level, then please post a comment, let us know what kinds of things do you have to optimize, what gets optimized in your code in order to improve performance, and I think we can all learn from that. So thank you very much if you do that. Take the time for it. Mage Cecil says, on a board with poor VRMs, is it worth looking into a beefy downdraft cooler? to help keep the VRMs cool while pushing bigger overclocks, or is it not worth it because the coolers can't handle those big clocks? Anyway, there is part of some truth to that. I talked about this in a previous episode on downdraft coolers, and I think it was just like, are downdraft coolers better or something like that? It was an AskGN video. And the answer is a downdraft cooler will help the VRM cooling, but you might become limited on CPUs, as you said, and there are better ways to cool a VRM. And ultimately the problem is just like, yeah, the VRM is going to be a bit cooler by having that air go over it, even if it's warm air. This is something people lose track of a lot, where they'll post comments and say, well, but the air is hot because it came off the CPU cooler, and now that hot air is going over the VRM. Yes, but it's still better than no airflow, like a sealed tomb. And when you're talking about a component like a MOSFET, that can go to 120 plus degrees easily in really bad conditions and bad design. So in those conditions, any airflow is better than no airflow, unless it's coming out of like a heat gun. So yes, they do help with VRM thermals, but typically downdraft coolers are going to be more limited than your average CLC or like big Noctua air cooler or something like that. So it's a balancing act, and you'll end up being bottlenecked by a CPU before the VRMs in that case, most likely. But I talked about this for several minutes in the other AskGN. Maybe just search the channel for like downdraft cooler. I think you'll find it. Last one. Actalzy says, you do a lot of case reviews and talk about airflow a lot. Would it be possible to get a video on some good airflow setups, fan positions, especially in regards to this new trend with the glass right up against the fans? Some solutions to this for better airflow, for instance, would be reversing it so the airflow comes up from the back and top. Okay, so yeah, I get the gist here. We can and have talked about this. The trouble with this particular question is if you're getting cases, I can give you like guidelines, but case testing, as we've said, is one of the least scientific approaches to any kind of testing, because every single component impacts airflow. There's a radial or axial fan on the GPU. There's a tower cooler, liquid cooler. What's the fan configuration on the case? Are you using the same fans? Does that even make sense versus using the stock fans? All this stuff. So let me give you some brief guidelines, just things to consider, and then try to apply those to your case. Because every case and hardware configuration will be different. So they're not all going to be the same. Like if I tell you put a fan in the top front as intake, and with this case, with this setup, you might get 3 degrees cooler performance. That's not going to be 3 degrees for everything. So couple things to consider. First one is that even though, and I've said this before, even though hot air rises, it does not come close to combating the speed of a fan. So hot air might rise, but cold air can rise too when you're blasting it through a 2,000 RPM fan. So things to consider here. Several times in our testing, there have been cases where if you take a fan and mount it in the top, but not the back, the top front, as in before the CPU cooler, and sort of the canonical view of the airflow pipeline, as it were. If you mount it to the top front as intake, that'll push air basically straight into the CPU. It won't have to contend with the GPU for it or any other components. It's just for the CPU. That works really well in a lot of cases. You have dust considerations here. I'm not going to talk about those too much today, but there are dust considerations. Keep that in mind. So that's one thing a lot of people don't think about is it's just, and myself included many years ago when I was starting, is that you think I should put exhaust on the top because that just makes sense. And it does, absolutely. But for some cases with tower coolers especially, it is actually better just to do top intake. Another thing to consider, exhaust in the top front will actually oftentimes hurt CPU performance. And that's because if you have air coming in from the front of the case and you have an exhaust fan here and a tower cooler here, just kind of imagine it all, the air comes in and like half of it's going to get pulled straight out. It'll never touch a single component of the case. It'll get removed from the system before it gets to the CPU. And so we've done tests in case reviews before where you'll see thermals are much worse actually when you have any path of exhaust that is reached by the intake before it reaches a component to cool down said component. So that's a consideration. You could do, for example, another thing to consider, top intake. Again, if you do top intake, but it's kind of like behind the CPU cooler, it's certainly not going to help the CPU very much at that point. Especially, I mean, it's most likely just going in and then out of the exhaust fan. But if it's behind or above the tower cooler and it's blowing air, like say above, blowing air through the fins and down, then you'll get your GPU a couple degrees warmer, maybe 1 to 3, not much. That does apply pretty universally. That's because you're now pushing hot air into the back of the GPU. So that's something to think about. Bottom intake is a great way to cool the GPU. Power supplies shrouds are a great way to obstruct cooling to the GPU. But there are shrouds that work really well, like NZXT's H500 shroud just happens to work actually pretty damn well. So yeah, bottom intake's a great way if your case supports it and it's near the GPU to get video card temperatures down specifically. Side intake is absolutely unbeatable for GPU cooling especially, but CPU in some scenarios. And that's just because it's so damn close. The closer you get the fan, especially if it's also still close to the source of the intake, the closer you get the fan to the component, the cooler the component's going to be when the air hits it, because the air doesn't have to travel as far, and so the pressure is going to be higher, and so it'll be able to help dissipate more heat off of whatever fin stack you're cooling. Other things to consider. What else should I mention here? Oh yeah, this is a good one. The Phoenix ENSO. This is something that I think is pretty uncommon to consider. We certainly didn't consider it until we tested it. Phoenix ENSO had an interesting one. So if you mounted a fan, I can't remember if it was at the top or the middle, but it had 2 or 3 fan slots in the front. And what would happen is if you mounted a fan or 2 fans in some of them, but not the last 1 or 2 slots, it would actually get, because there was no place for air to exhaust in that case really, or there was at least less exhaust space than there was intake space, what would happen is the hot air would go through the cooler or whatever on the CPU. Some of it would get out of the case, but it doesn't have enough pressure to get all of it out, and the pressure system is positive intake. So what happens is a lot of it recirculates around the cooler, and it'll either get sucked back in as warmed air and just kind of cycle and create this nasty cycle, or it'll actually get pulled towards the front of the case by the intake fans, because the intake fans aren't exposed enough to the outside, so they're pulling air in from inside the case behind them, and it'll recirculate back through there. And that's a pretty interesting phenomenon that we saw with the ENSO, if you want to check it out, the Phoenix ENSO. So, I don't know, there's a lot more here to talk about. That's pretty good, I think. You could also add directional fans inside the case that aren't directly exposed to air, but are just directional to redirect the air that's gotten into the case. So like something just on a spike over the VRM, or something, if it's a gigantic, huge case, you have like another fan in here somewhere just to kind of keep the air directed at the component you want to direct it at, and things like that. And then pressure systems also consider. So this is kind of interesting too. In our H500 review, the NZXT one, we found that having 2 exhaust fans actually worked way better than we thought, even for GPU cooling. And part of that is because it was a negative pressure system. The air is only going out, so cool air will find its way in through whatever holes are in the case to equalize the pressure system. And some of that meant that air was getting actually pulled in through the back of the expansion slot, for the PCIe expansion slot for the video card, and getting pulled into the video card from outside the back of the case. It actually worked pretty well. But then there are other times where, like in the Asus Mini ITX prototype we saw at Computex, talked about in the video with Linus about products that most need improvement at Computex. Another thing that can happen is you might have exhaust like from the power supply at the back, and then a pressure system that will pull some of that air in and into the video card. And that just happens based on if it's like a negative pressure system or something like that, and there's nowhere else for it to get access to air. Lots of really fun things. So yeah, that's super quick recap, of some of our case testing over the last year. I can't possibly do it justice and sum it all up. Keep watching our case reviews. We talk about it all the time. I think that gives you a few cool ideas though of what can happen. And hopefully you can just look at your own case and try to think about where each of those makes sense. It's different for every case. I've given you guidelines. I think you can use them to figure out what makes sense in your scenario. That's it for this one. We just shot, that's the third one. After moving furniture and building it for like 16 plus hours yesterday, and then also coming home and doing way more work for videos. So Sorry if I'm a bit tired. Stick with me. We've got a really cool office move coming up. So looking forward to it because it's going to be a lot more technical content than we could do here. And yeah, subscribe for more. Go to patreon.com/gamersnexus to help us out directly. Go to store.gamersnexus.net to pick up one of our mod mats. They are in stock and shipping now. And we're trying to keep them in stock, but we're having trouble. So we might run out of this run as well. Get your order in sooner than later if you want it. Otherwise, video card posters we have in abundance. They are pretty popular. And I signed 10 of them, which are being distributed at random as people buy these. So it might be a couple of those left as well. I might go sign a couple more just for fun next time I'm over there. That's it for this one. Thanks for watching. I'll see you all next time.